The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM-LP at 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw on Embers to Goodness. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can send us emails with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net.
If you care to, you can send us letters with questions or suggestions or whatever at The Final Straw or TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816.
The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week we spoke with Nani Ferreira-Mathews. Nani is the author of Birthright, Travelogue of an American Radical in Israel, Palestine, published by On Our Own Authority, or OOOA, Books out of Atlanta earlier this year. Nani has Indigenous, Hawaiian, and Jewish heritage and talks about how in 2013 she went on the Taglit-Birthright tour in Israel, which is offered to Jews raised outside of Israel. In this case, mostly those of the trip were from the US, Canada, and Europe. Getting into it, she already had some misgivings, but throughout the tour, she became more and more aware of the trip as a means to erase Palestinian and Indigenous perspectives from visibility to the tourists, who were being groomed for populating the spaces seized by Israel as a Jewish-only territory and state, or being a supporter living abroad. We talk about Zionism as a nationalist movement, the manipulation of the tourist on this free trip, including setting up romantic situations among the guests and IDF soldiers who were present, and sleep deprivation. We talk about funding sources for Taglit-Birthright and comparisons between the erasure of or commodification of non-hegemonic ethnic or religious identities or marginalized minority populations in the history and culture of the United States and Israel. We also talk about the BDS, or Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement, a Palestinian-led protest movement to economically and culturally push Israel to end the occupation. Next week, we'll be airing a conversation with activists working on political prisoner and human rights issues in Palestine, so stay tuned. And in the show notes, we have links to a couple of the resources that Nani mentions.
In an update to the International Days of Action Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism that we read an announcement from last week, in the Crime Think ex-worker Hotwire weekly podcast number 43, you can hear an interview with members of the Outlive Them network who are calling for the day, as well as an anarchist from the Tree of Life synagogue, where the terrible anti-Semitic attack happened in Pittsburgh last week. You can find a link in our show notes to that podcast.
But first, dear listeners, we would be remiss to leave the fact of birthright citizenship coming under fire recently here in the so-called U.S. without comment. Birthright citizenship, which was established by the 14th Amendment to grant citizenship to freed slaves, and is characterized by the idea that all people born in the United States are U.S. citizens, regardless of race or where their parents came from. Despite this being a practice which had been reinforced by law, namely the Constitution and the courts, more about that in a minute, white supremacists have often tried to tie the concept of, quote, U.S. citizenship into an understanding of, quote, whiteness by restricting birthright along racial lines, citing non-white people as unassimilatable. You can read more about this in a Raw Story article entitled "This Isn't the First Time White Supremacists Have Tried to Cancel Birthright Citizenship," which we'll link to in the show notes. This is also not the first time that the current voices on top of this garbage pile that we call a government have utilized otherizing strategies to further attempt to divide and stratify the thinking regarding non-white, non-cis, and non-papers-having folks. We don't have to think very far back for examples of this kind of behavior, and I don't really think they bear repeating here. Back to the laws, though, citizenship as we know it is a very problematic structure. It is so closely wrapped up in colonialism and overwhelming biases toward the wealthy and white so as to be practically indistinguishable. If any of the components which make up citizenship were to be in any way compromised, the whole system might topple. Its colonizer nature, which is at the same time very established and with many supporting structures, but also very fragile and riddled with internal contradictions, is also to point here. The U.S. government, in our view, should not have the right to determine who is legitimate on stolen land. If you or someone you know have a perspective on citizenship which is anti-colonial and would like to talk about it with us for a future radio piece, please get in touch at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or tfsradioshow@protonmail.com and make the subject heading anti-citizenship. We're seeking to trouble and nuance this conversation in any way and would love to hear from you.
And here's a really quick update about prisoners. There's a phone zap for hunger striking prisoners in Toledo, Ohio. 7 people incarcerated in Toledo Correctional Institution went on strike on Friday, November 2nd. They refused to be moved into the yard for recreation time until the SWAT or SRT team moved them and are going on hunger strike and refusing food. SWAT and SRT, or Security Risk Team, have used rubber bullets against protesters in Toledo before. They're protesting renovations to add more solitary confinement wings. In the past 2 months, the state has been trying to turn the entirety of Toledo into a lockdown institution. As a result, people have been sent to solitary because other units didn't have room. And for minor infractions, that wouldn't have been reason to send someone to solitary confinement otherwise. Many people in the, quote, 4B overflow, unquote, unit in D4 North were sent there because the lower security or not solitary confinement 4B unit did not have enough room. People in solitary, including overflow solitary, can't receive books, and guards in the 4B overflow unit have been abusive, spit in food, refused to give inmates food trays or given them empty food trays, and harassed black inmates. Attempts to go through the grievance process have been ignored. According to a comrade on the outside, quote, once they finish the solitary confinement blocks, you sneeze the wrong way and you're going to be in the hole. Everyone in the whole institution is getting sick and tired of cops trying to lock the whole place down, unquote. 4 of the prisoners on strike are David Easley, Richard Harris, Elijah Bowen, and James Ward. 3 others are striking, but asked to remain anonymous. They're demanding that people in the 4B overflow unit be moved out of solitary confinement and have asked to be moved to the A1 East unit. You can call to protest the expansion of solitary confinement, racist harassment, and denial of food at the whims of abusive officers. On Saturday, prisoners were maced and refused the ability to wash the chemical weapons off of their bodies overnight. Mass calls are happening this Monday, 11/5, or November 5th, remember, but you can start now as well. ODRC Interim Director Stuart Hudson's number is 614-387-0588. That's 614-387-0588. The Ohio Correctional Institution Inspection Committee is 614-466-6649. That's 614-466-6649. The Office of Inspector General is 614-644-9110. That's 614-644-9110. And the Toledo Correctional Institution can be reached at 419-726-7977. More information and updates on this situation can be found at incarceratedworkers.org.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. And here's a jingle from another.
From Embers is a show produced about anarchist ideas and practice across so-called Canada. Every week we spend about an hour going in-depth about ideas, histories, and ongoing struggles that we think are important. We're a part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. You can check it all out at fromembers.libsyn.com.
So I'm speaking with Nani Ferreira-Mathews, the author of the 2018 book Birthright. out from On Our Own Authority Books. Thanks a lot for coming onto the show and being willing to chat, Nani.
Thank you for having me.
First, can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this book?
Sure. Yeah, so in 2013, I went on this popular free 10-day trip to Israel, Palestine, known as Birthright. And also in 2013, I spent that entire year researching alternative communities, like communes and collectives in kibbutzim. And I was collecting data on how these collective living spaces made decisions and create internal governing agreements inside of existing sort of governments. So the Birthright trip afforded me the opportunity to study in the Middle East. So I spent several months after the trip in Israel and Palestine. And then when I returned to the U.S. later that year, I continued my research in communes in Central Virginia and in New York City. And then after I returned, it became pretty apparent that the experience I had on Birthright was as important as the work I was doing on the communes. And it kind of took the front seat, I guess, so to speak. And so I wrote this narrative because there was not really an open critique when I went on the trip. I spend the first chapter of the book just going over how many places I looked for this critique, how many people I asked for a critique, and it just didn't exist 5 years ago. So it just became pretty vital that I write this sort of just full-on, day-by-day, moment-by-moment critique of this trip that calls itself apolitical. So that's how it started, and then it was published this year.
Are you still working on the information about collectives and communes and kibbutzim and such?
So that was in preparation for a anthropology degree that I will likely continue in the future, but now I'm more engaged in the conversation around this book, which finally is released, and then working in, because my mother is Hawaiian and I'm also from a Hawaiian background, so I've been doing some work in the Hawaiian, some of the rights of the Hawaiian indigenous people. So it's kind of on the back burner, but it's still there.
Can you talk a little bit about who the audience for this book about the Birthright program would be and what you'd like them to get out of the book?
For sure. I think that what I've met with the release of this book is that some of the older Jewish people that I know think it's only for young Jewish people. First of all, it's not really a limited audience. It's a very informative narrative, so it's for anyone who's interested in the politics of Israel. I'd say it has a target audience and a mission to thwart the program and to stop people from going on it. So if we were going to limit it, it would be really specifically for 18 to 26-year-old Jewish Americans who qualify for the Birthright trip. But in its content, I think it has a lot of valuable information for any activist. You can see the day-by-day political agenda of the Zionist movement inside of the pages of this book. So I think it's really an important piece for anyone who is interested in the topic of Israel-Palestine.
Can you talk a little bit or break down what Taglit-Birthright is, maybe its funding, its purpose, and so forth?
Yeah, so this is something I've come across while doing book talks, is that a lot of people in the audience have not gone on Birthright but kind of know what it is. So I've had to do a little bit of discussion just to inform the audience. So I'll go over a little of that now for you as well. It's I'm just going to come and pull some of this stuff out of the book. But so Taglit-Birthright is the name of the group that funds these trips. So Taglit is the Hebrew word for discover, and Taglit-Birthright is the parent organization that funds all these trips. Each year, about 40,000 qualifying Jewish adults travel to Israel as a part of this program. There are 13 trip organizers. I think that might have been whittled down a little over the past couple of years. But when I published and wrote this, there were 13 trip organizers that were approved by Taglit-Birthright, and they organize and facilitate trips out of North America. I'd say it costs about $3,000 a participant. And on my trip alone, there were 40 people, and their operating costs overall annually are around $300 million. When I was in Israel, Taglit-Birthright was celebrating its 13th year. And everything that was in the trip is cultivated by its donors and specifically the Israeli government. I have in my book a little note that in 2011, Israel announced that it would donate $100 million to Taglit over a 3-year period. And that $100 million that they're going to put in over 3 years, they've got back into the Israeli economy just hand over fist. It's $825 million has been funneled back into the Israel economy since Birthright began. So they put a little bit in, but most of the funding comes from philanthropists and Jewish Americans who identify with, Zionism and who side with Israel. But also the state of Israel is heavily invested in it. While they only give a little, they get the most back into their economy. So that's a little bit about what it is. Do you have any other questions about it?
Well, yeah. So you broke down the economic side of it, but I'd like to know a little bit more about like the point that you can read out of it that the Israeli government and that the Zionist movement or Zionist supporting movement like is actually pushing for by creating. Like it seems like there's a conscious effort to that you break down throughout the book to make people personally identify, historically and spiritually identify with the land base and with the project of occupying that land base and making it a Jewish-only settler state.
Can you clarify the question of that?
Oh, yeah. I was wondering, besides just the economic benefits that like citizens and industries within Israel get from the birthright, I'm wondering what you think the influence or the attempted influence of Birthright is towards creating a wider consensus about the legitimacy of the state of Israel as a Jewish-only state.
Sure. Yeah, actually, it's a really good point. So the money's easy to follow. You can see that Israel puts money in and that they get money out. But as far as the content goes and the kind of the story that you're given as a participant, it fuels the Zionist identity. It starts from day one. It starts from moment one when you get on the bus and they hand you a map. And in the map that you receive, you open it up and it's the state of Israel and there is no West Bank. And so it looks like right away that there is no Palestine. And what ends up happening throughout the entire trip is that no one on the trip, none of the organizers or tour guides say Palestine. If they do, it's only quietly among private conversations. It's a big point to kind of just a continuation of the erasure of the Palestinian indigenous population. So that's part of the theme in it that fuels the Zionist movement.
Continuing on with that kind of like theme, I appreciate how you brought up common structures between the U.S. and Israel as modern settler colonial states. Can you talk about how it was to travel from one to another, and did it give you any insights into the U.S.? I'm sure particularly because you had perspectives coming from an indigenous Hawaiian heritage that you would have some stuff to say about that.
Yeah, actually, so before I went to Israel, I read a bunch of different things about about the history of the state's creation, and so in those readings, you learn a lot about the war tactics used on this pretty unanticipating indigenous population, and then when you get over there, when I was there, and just seeing the total erasure of that culture, and also just being straight lied to at different points. Like, for example, when we go to the Bedouin quote unquote village, it's just set up representation of a Bedouin culture that Taglit trips go on, and you ride a camel there and you talk about Bedouin culture, but I mean, it's like the most visibility that any sort of other indigenous culture gets during the trip. And it's just a fabricated identity as well. So seeing that firsthand and then coming back to America, I think I had even more insight than I thought I would have had out of it. And that's when I started to really think about what it means to have this Hawaiian indigenous background and how the U.S. took this place, Hawaii, and made it into a state, and instead of erasing the culture, just kind of integrated it in and exploited it and made it this cool tiki bar sort of life style, and totally capitalized on not erasing the culture, but kind of integrating it into the U.S. identity. And so the trip to Israel opened my eyes in a way that almost like putting something, when we were in the Bedouin camp, it's like you're putting it right there, but you're exploiting it. And we're doing the same thing with Hawaii. So it definitely opened my eyes a lot more to that experience, having gone there. And then on top of all of that, you have just the same tactics that get used in schooling in the U.S., where you briefly talk about the Native American people who were on the North American continent before European settlers came over. But it's so brief. If you spend a week or two on it in school throughout your entire schooling, I mean, that's a long time. So it's almost the same thing over in Israel, just a settler-colonialism sort of tactic where you talk briefly about it, but it's always that, these people were painted as small in number. Same thing goes for the U.S. and for Israel. Small in number. There was no one here really, but history shows us otherwise, and that they were often uneducated and not very modern in a culture. And so you kind of have very similar approaches in both the North America and in Israel, where you get this erasure, and then at times you get this kind of bringing in a culture for your own benefit to show how multicultural you are. So I don't know. There are themes in all settler colonial states that are transferable, I guess, and those are some of them.
Yeah. And then alongside the erasure or the small marginal references, I guess, given to those cultures, it seems like the temporality of it is like, oh yeah, that happened. They were here, and now here they are. Sort of erases the ongoing genocide that is being engaged in by the dominant culture, which I know you at least mentioned in the book a few times, having trouble even addressing, but were able to address at one point during a go around before visiting the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah. It definitely has happened in my schooling in the U.S., but over there too.
So what was the content of the tour that you were given, and how did you see others on the trip engage with the material and change during the trip?
Right. Okay. So one of the biggest parts of this trip is the way that it manipulates the people on the trip to perceive Israel. So all of the activities that you'll see that I highlight throughout the trip, specifically one in which we're addressing, we're being asked to address what it means, what world Jewry means to us, and how it ties into Israel. So they spend the entirety of this one afternoon getting 40 young Jewish American adults to discuss world Jewry in relation to Israel. And not at any point does it really discuss world Jewry not in relation to Israel. So that's just one of the things that happens, where the organizers make a very obvious effort to tie in Judaism and Israel as one sort of thread. And then another thing that will happen throughout the trip, and what I witnessed, is the exploitation of Jewish guilt, specifically around the Holocaust Museum experience, where, and it happens, and I've heard it happens in Jewish summer camps as well, where this idea that this tragedy happened, that is the Holocaust, no doubt, undeniably a tragedy happened. But as you go through this museum in Jerusalem and on the Birthright trip, it's expected that each and every person who goes through this tour will have an emotional response that is I would say, even more. I think the more you cry, the harder you cry, the more honorable you are. That's the kind of thing, the sentiment that gets passed on as you go through this trip. And so a lot of people who are on it are emotionally manipulated into having like such a visceral response to this tragedy, but under the umbrella of the Zionist sort of propaganda, that it's the reason that you can feel safe to cry, I guess. And I saw on my trip 40 people, maybe 35 people who wept at the end of the tour. And it almost felt like at some point during that 10 days, it was only a matter of time before you would have that emotional response. And if you didn't have it, then you were sort of void, or you didn't have any sort of tie to the place or to the trip. And it's just a myriad of different emotional manipulation that happens throughout the trip. And I saw many people engage with that manipulation, and also kind of you see them start to identify their Jewish heritage with the state of Israel as you go from site to site, and your tour guide tells you more and more about how this place is your home and how you belong here and you're finally home. And so it's a very manipulative trip, and many people on it have those suffer those from some of that manipulation.
So there's a term that we both used a couple of times, Zionism, that's like, oftentimes I think it's misdefined, or it's like a taboo term in a lot of circles because it's used so differently by different people. So would you mind breaking down like what the term Zionism means in the context that we're talking about? Sure,
yeah. So Zionism is a political movement. It started in the late 1800s. It's a movement that was, I guess it was used. The idea of it was, and it probably had a genuine beginning, in that there was a persecution of Jewish people in Europe, and there was an attempt to kind of band together and find a resolution. But what ended up happening is it became a gigantic political and militaristic movement that, in order to succeed, had to find an actual physical place to exist. So after it started in the late 1800s, goes into the state of Israel, finally is created in 1948. And so in those years leading up to it, and there's a really great book that I reference in my book. I can try to find the title. I think one of the best resources that I found for defining the Zionist history is by Ilan Pappé. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. Ilan Pappé, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. That book really lays it out year by year and all the way up until the creation of the State of Israel. And it shows you that Zionism is just a political movement that needed a physical place to exist to justify itself. And that physical place was actually between Argentina and what is Palestine. And it ended up becoming Palestine being the place in which some of the leaders of the Zionist movement thought it would be easier to erase the culture there. And all of this stuff is in this book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. So Zionism is a political movement that became a militaristic movement that still exists in a place that needed to, it needed a place to occupy, and that place was Palestine. So when we talk about Zionism, it is a political movement. And often what happens is people think of it's hard to kind of navigate. Even people who are against it don't want to really identify as anti-Zionist. For example, the Jewish Voice for Peace, they wrote a blurb for the back of the book. They gave me a really great recommendation and enjoyed the content, and also have a movement that is called Return the Birthright, in which they encourage young Jewish Americans to not go on the birthright trips. But they also do not have, they don't have, I guess, a strong stance against Zionism, as it were. So like you had mentioned, sometimes it can be kind of hard to define, and I think that's why they stay away from it, because they don't want to get tangled up in it. But it's not that hard to define in my eyes. I think it's very obviously a political group of people with political ambitions, and it doesn't really have that much to do with the faith of the Jewish faith, in my opinion.
And like, to contextualize too, that movement towards having a homeland for your nationality or identity or whatever, in the late 1800s, that's when nationalism was sweeping different groups throughout Europe. And so whether it be like pan-German or pan-Slavic or Celtic or whatever, and in particular groups that considered themselves to be culturally repressed within the European context had similar movements to this, and they still kind of exist to some degree. But whereas Zionism is often pointed to as this like standalone like aberration or whatever, but it's a historical, political process and philosophical movement like many others.
Right.
And now here's a track called "People Not Places" featuring A Beer by Invincible, a hip hop artist out of Detroit, off of the album Shapeshifters.
Do you ever miss back home? I miss people, but I don't miss places.
Prepare for takeoff, touchdown, Ben Gurion, strict search, make sure nobody enter with bombs. Blue, white flag for this birthright tour I'm on. Never mention 3 villages that the airport is on. Recent history buried, but it speaks to the sand. All Jews, law of return, I don't seem to understand. A land without a people for people without a land. But I see a man standing with a key and a deed in his hand. Museum of the Holocaust, walking outside in the distance, all go throwing a Molotov. Houses burned with kerosene, mass graves couldn't bear the scene. It wasn't a pogrom, it was the ruins of their Yassin. Shopping at the Kenya and Malha, built it on the back of the town Al Malha. Wishing we could call its name, appalled by the change, and now a marvel of chains is all that remains. My evil misses people, not places. Actually see the towns with names of Arabic, the Hebrew places. The policies is evil and racist, deceitful and heinous. You'll never be a people stable, legal displacement.
تذكر اسامي بلادنا قبل ما تيجي انت تبدلها. اتذكر قولي كيف ما اشتاق لوطن عايش فينا.
At the Wailing Wall, I'm rolling a wish, then sticking in between a hole and the bricks. I'm feeling more than melancholy. This used to be the Moroccan quarter until we stopped them short. And now they grandkids is the ones that storming rocks at borders. I ain't wanna play and I don't pray often, so I'm AWOLing. While you making native sons feel like a stranger in their homeland, like James Baldwin. This ain't about a Quran or a synagogue, a mosque, a Torah. Colonizers break it into acres and dunhams, erasing the culture when they change hyper to hyper. Change Jaffa to Yafo, the old city left to haunt. Hummus pronounced hummus, we ate in the restaurant. Next hit the discotheque, yes we on the list of guests. Palestinians can't get in, it's blatant disrespect. Cops stopping for speaking their languages, it's dangerous to repeat it when we're history we disconnect. My even misses people, not places. Actually see the towns with names of Arabic, the Hebrew places. The policies is evil and racist, deceitful and heinous. You'll never be a people stable, legal displacement.
تذكر اسامي بلادنا قبل ما تيجي انت تبدلها. اتذكر قولي كيف ما اشتاق لوطن عايش فينا.
200-year-old olive trees uprooted the groves to build a wall, now they future enclosed. Settlement spreading like cancer and toxic sewage polluted the roads. Not full of checkpoints that superimpose the truth and it shows. Village ruins overgrown with planted trees. Who'd have thought the desert blooms a tubage spot? I can't believe it ain't environmental. Disguising lies, extincting lives like manatees. Calling it a transfer, please, more like a catastrophe. birthright towards recruiting them, confuse them into moving in. Claim it's only names and words, but denying the root of them. Power been abusing it, our past never excusing them. 60 years since 48 and 40 since Jerusalem. My boy Shaddy wanted to visit us so badly. He lied, he's diabetic to see it for 5 seconds. 194 ruled the courts in the case. Mom, you can't disconnect the people from the importance of place. My email misses people, not places. Has she seen the towns with names in Arabic, the Hebrew replaces? The policies is evil and racist, deceitful and heinous. You'll never be a peaceful state with legal displacement.
But so, like, a project of the Israeli government and its supporters is to make no space for criticism of that nation-state's policies and to conflate Zionism and Judaism. From your experience from the trip, did you get a sense of how Israelis at the same time can, like, back their state and the legacy? Like, I guess you've kind of talked about this in terms of, like, the being able to hold in their head the like the terrible things of not only the Holocaust, but also like anti-Semitic attacks or the pogroms that were happening in Eastern Europe. And at the same time, some of those, like in the name of Zionism, some like similar genocide or ethnic displacement is enacted upon the native Palestinian populations. Was there like a time when you had a conversation with any Israelis who had been through it or any of the soldiers and sort of got a view into their mind about how they view those two things at the same time?
Sure. It's a really good question because the answer is yes. But if I'm answering it in the context of this 10-day trip, the answer is no. So if you go on this trip, you're not going to find out the opinions of an Israeli citizen. While you do, there is a point in the trip that's known as Mifgash, and that's the portion in which the IDF sends 5 or 6 soldiers that are in your age group onto the trip with you. And the idea is that you'll have an opportunity to discuss some of these things that you brought up with Israeli citizens. But what happens is not that. And in fact, there's specifically in my trip a point in which we were told that we were going to have a serious discussion with the soldiers, that we were going to sit down and talk about what it's like to be a young Israeli and to ask some of these really important questions and talk about some of their points. And what ended up happening was that conversation didn't take place. And I'm not certain that it ever was really going to take place. I'm not 100% sure, but what ended up happening in the night we were going to have that conversation, the tour guide said it was too heavy, quote unquote, too heavy. So we were going to do something more fun. And that more fun thing ends up being a bunch of hookup games. So that's pretty unfortunate. That the only time we actually had engagement with any Israeli citizens, it was very highly encouraged that we just hook up with them. And that happens, that's a theme throughout the entire trip, where you either hook up with someone on your trip or you hook up with the Israeli citizens. So the conversation never really happens when you're on the trip. You never have the opportunity to get a really honest opinion. And you have to keep in mind, too, that the soldiers who were on the trip were vetted before they got there. They were asked a questionnaire, and they're also asked if they're single. So they often don't allow soldiers to join the trip unless they are single. And so it's hard to get an honest conversation out of them, even though I did try a couple of times earnestly to just discuss what it's like. And you don't really get that kind of perspective because, you know, they're there and they have a mission as they're on that trip. So no, when you're on that 10-day trip, you're probably not going to get an honest perspective. However, I did stay 3 months later, and that's when I had the opportunity to talk to Israeli citizens firsthand and to stay in their homes and to find out more about how they feel about everything and to talk about the trip with them. And that's when you get a more honest perspective. I couldn't say that anyone that I talked to was highly political. Mostly it was just kind of talking about the complexity of it. A lot of times the citizens there that I encountered would talk about the complexity of it. And that's kind of something that we all here that it's such a complex issue, and it's just, if you start reading, you'll find out that it's not that complex. A group of people that we've identified as Zionists previously in this conversation took it upon themselves to find a place to settle. That place was Palestine. They then used that political ideology to erase that culture. And so it's not that complicated. It's just people don't want to talk about it. So you'll find that a lot, but you won't find it when you're on this trip, unfortunately.
I could see it being a complicated, or, I mean, definitely if people are avoiding talking about it, that complicates it or makes it a thing in their head, but complicates it for people that are born into Israel, or, who are like, I mean, I was born in the United States, settler colonial context that stands on an ongoing genocide of many indigenous peoples. And I mean, that's a complex thing of like, I was born here, I'm from here, but I'm not native to here, Right. Is that kind of what you think they're pointing to in a way? Is just like the conversations, maybe it troubles so much of my identity at its very base, including a living thing that needs to have a home and identify with a home, that it gets rather muddy?
I to be honest with you, I couldn't draw upon any specific conversations that I had now that would highlight some of the things we're discussing. I think that if I were to try, it would be a fabrication of my memories. I can only say that, to my recollection, most people, when I were there, though we did discuss it, it often was boiled down to just being a very complex issue. I will say that something I like about is Israeli and Palestinian people that is different from the U.S. is that they're very open about how political everything is. Just anything that you could imagine, the color of a building could be political. But in the U.S., we're not necessarily like that. So I thought that while maybe the conversations, I can't recall them specifically, there is this like earnest understanding that it's super political and everything is political. And I appreciated that, the culture's embracing of that idea.
I want to ask another question about the tour, if you don't mind, that I didn't write in there.
Okay.
But around the content, you were talking about how the heteronormative, just to throw out a bunch of jargon, heteronormative reproductive futurism of the tour, kind of like this feeling that the people who are running the tour wanted you to hook up either with other people that were on the tour with you in this, like, what could be for a lot of people really maybe not romantic in like the sexual way, but a very romantic situation of going and visiting a place that you're told over and over again is your historical homeland, this place that you've been educated about and read about, that's like history is going back thousands of years in holy books and in like family reminiscences and such, or to hook up with Israeli soldiers who are there. In either case, sort of like tying yourself in this emotional, physical bond to the land base, and also like Israel has parsed no terms about like wanting to populate certain of its regions more and more, and Birthright seems to fit very well into this idea that we bring more settlers over to become to identify with the project of Israel and also to like fill up its lands. That was like, I don't know if that's a thing that you wanted to talk about more in more detail, or if I'm misrepresenting or misunderstanding it. That's like kind of what I got out of reading your book.
No, it's actually one of the, I would say one of the biggest points that happens on the trip is this continued effort to get us to hook up. Like you said, whether it's with the people in the group or with the Israeli citizens, it's not a hidden agenda, I don't think. Maybe it was supposed to be, but it's really an obvious agenda to get people on the trip to hook up. In the last day of the trip, we actually had this pretty irreverent sort of public speaker. He was compelling, but he was also problematic. But one of the things that I did appreciate that he said was he jokingly referred to the trip as birth rate. And he did not apologize afterward. He was like, "What? It's not a surprise, is it?" It just was a really beautiful confirmation of a thing that we all could see happening on the trip. But something that you mentioned too about just the population of trying to continue the population in the bringing in more Jewish settlers to Israel is a big part of the political strategy for the state of Israel, and it happens on this trip over and over again. You see, it's not just the hookups, but the idea that you will identify with the state of Israel as your homeland and then eventually make what they call aliyah, which is the Hebrew word for, I think, to step up or to raise up. And to make aliyah, you would move to Israel. So that's kind of the end goal, is that you go on this trip and you fall in love with it and you identify with it. Perhaps you fall in love with an Israeli citizen or even a person on the trip, and you love Israel so much that you'll move there. And if you move there, then you can make aliyah. And aliyah for the state of Israel is a program that offers a very comfortable absorption package, which I go into a little bit in the book. So you can apply online, and the state of Israel will pay for your flight. It will pay for your home. It will help you find a job and give you an absorption package for up to 18 months for a certain amount of money that changes each year. It's definitely one of the biggest themes in the trip, to get you to both have a romantic sort of encounter with the state of Israel and a romantic encounter, hopefully, with someone on the trip, and then to eventually move there. And that's the end goal. There are numbers in the book where I go over how many people have actually moved and how many people have gone on the trip. But it is one of the biggest themes and goals of the Birthright trip. Yeah.
And is that open to anyone who can prove a Jewish heritage? Like you mentioned a few times, thinking in your head during discussions, like, oh, what about all these like Jews from Africa who are having trouble getting into the state? Are they offered similar things, or is it only people from countries that tend to be whiter or tend to have like geopolitical connections, or how does that work?
Right. So I think that there is what you'll see on the trip, which maybe I don't really mention, but I've had the question since I've been talking this year about it, is that the people who are on it are white American Jews. And there is definitely a need for asylum for some African Jewish people, and the state of Israel will grant it. Though I did see while I was there, not necessarily on the trip, but after, when I was in Tel Aviv and different cities, just this separation of white Jewish affluent people who make aliyah versus people who come as refugees, and often from Africa, people of color, Jewish people of color, and the way that they're treated and the way that they're put into places like sort of refugee areas versus these absorption packages which are offered to like a Jewish American person like myself, who would look and appear to be an affluent white North American Jew. But the way that the state of Israel lays it out for you to qualify at all is as follows, and is really the reason that I even qualify is because of how far removed you can be according to the state of Israel. And that is, if your step grandmother, you can go as far back as long as your step grandmother was Jewish, then you qualify to make aliyah. You qualify to go on birthright, and you qualify to become an Israeli citizen. So it doesn't necessarily need to be by blood. It does need to be on your grandmother's side, and it can be as far back as a marriage. So in my particular instance, it was my step-grandmother who was Jewish, and it's something that we inherited through her. So I think that they cast a wide net to get a certain kind of person like myself or other people who go on this trip. And in that net, they also get a lot of people who need asylum, and those people are coming from Africa. And there are groups that I met some people in Atlanta who are working specifically with Jews of color who experience a very different sort of welcome when they arrive in Israel. So, yeah, I guess that kind of answers some of that.
So it's been 5 years since you took this trip. In hindsight, what would you have said to the younger Nani, and how would you advise other young Jews seeking grounding or connection and who are talking about taking the Taglit-Birthright group?
This is a really important question because 5 years ago, I was unable to find a critique of the trip. I don't want to justify me going on it, because today, I'm the person who's saying, don't go to young Jewish Americans. But, when I went 5 years ago, people said, yeah, go, it was fun. And some people said I wouldn't go but they didn't have an informed reason. And so I think my experience and my choice to go was really based in the fact that I didn't have anyone who stepped up, who gave a critique, and who had openly opposed the trip in a way. And since I've gone on the trip, I have seen one or two articles that came out in The Guardian actually published something, and then the Huffington Post, and then 2017, which is only last year, the Jewish Voice for Peace started a Return the Birthright campaign. And then this year you have If Not Now, who encouraged and the walk-offs of the Birthright trip that happened this summer. And so there is a movement that is happening in which people are being encouraged to not go in the first place, or if you happen to be on it, to just get off of it. But I think I would say to myself, just be prepared for a little bit of a battle, because if you identify as an activist and you go on this trip, it's been said to me as well that I violated the boycott, and it's something I've had to come to terms with as an activist, not having that, I guess, the knowledge at the time to make that decision, to make what I would think if I were to be qualified now, I wouldn't go. I would know not to go. I would know that it would be a violation of the boycott, but I would say that 5 years ago, I didn't have any information to inform that decision. So it's kind of a little bit of a strange advice, because this book is part of the information that will inform future young Jewish Americans to hopefully not go on the trip. But also I feel like if I had this information then I wouldn't have gone. So I don't know what I would have told myself 5 years ago. I guess I would have just been like, go and write this book and help other people see the truth.
And you mentioned the boycott a couple times. Can you talk about BDS really briefly?
Sure. BDS is a Palestinian-led and organized boycott, divestments, and sanctions is what it stands for. And that's just an effort to not buy in, not support any sort of goods that come out of Israel. It has a long history. It's a very long movement. It actually started in, I believe, 2005, more or less. So that's a short answer.
And succinct. Thank you.
Yes.
Can I ask one more question about the trip?
Sure.
Okay. You talk throughout the book about how tired you are and how sleep deprived everyone seems to be. And do you think that was like a conscious effort on behalf of the organizers to just kind of keep people a little bit off balance throughout and running around from site to site? Because it's kind of hard to like critically engage with your surroundings outside of like emotion and some base like critical thinking if you're underslept, especially over a 10-day period. Or was that just like the circumstances of like, well, we were so busy and my people around me were so loud and whatever?
No, actually, if you compare some of the things that happen in the trip, some of the tactics that happen in the trip, to military strategy, you'll see that there's a pretty easy correlation that you can make between the two. And one of the military strategies is exhaustion. And so if you can, say you can't really like defeat your opponent right away in a military setting, then you exhaust them to the point of kind of you exhaust them to submission, basically. And so that's definitely an element that happens. You can see that it happens because you get on a bus as soon as you get off the plane. That's a 10-hour flight, and you're on a bus, and there's obviously going to be jet lag. But this trip is very unforgiving, and the way that it lays into you right away and never stops, I think is very calculated and a planned part of the trip.
Well, do you have any upcoming speaking events, or where can listeners find other writings by you?
So currently I am working with the Jewish Voice for Peace in DC to have a book talk in combination with one of their events in December of this year. I have a website, though pretty brief, that has some of my music and writings on it, and that's nanimathews.com, nanimathews.com. And I hope to have some more stuff written and published in different places soon. But that's it for now.
Was there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to mention?
Let's see. We did the PDF. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think I won't say anything about Pittsburgh because it'll just be a whole thing.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat and for publishing this book, and look forward to reading more about you in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM-LP at 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm Burst of Goodness. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can send us emails with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net.
If you care to, you can send us letters with questions or suggestions or whatever at The Final Straw or TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816.
The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
Be brave. We're ending this episode with a song from the album Checkpoint Rock, Songs for Palestine. The song is called Checkpoint Rock, same name as the documentary that the album is a soundtrack for, and is performed by a bunch of artists, including Manu Chao, Amal Marcus, Safa Arapiat, Khalas, Khair Fodi, Habib Aldik, Ayman PR, Saeed Murad, Fermin Muguruza, and Dam. To find past episodes of The Final Straw, you can subscribe to us in your favorite pod-catching device or visit the website thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org for 8 years of free audio. If you'd like to hear us on your local radio airwaves, contact your community radio station and tell them to check out the radio tab on our website. Or you can reach us via thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net, and we'll try to help in the process. We are up on the most obnoxious social media platforms and can easily be shared after we air.
If you appreciate this podcast and the voices that we bring to you each and every week, at least once a week, please consider a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal or LiberaPay. You can also subscribe to recurring donations for us at patreon.com/TFSR and get some pretty sweet swag. If you want one of the shirts or mixtapes or sticker and button packs that we offer to Patreon customers but can't afford a monthly donation, drop us an email and we'll try to work something out. You can find out more about ways to donate to The Final Straw Radio at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org/.
اليوم أول يوم من باقي عمري صفحة تبدأ بكلمة زي المفاتيح من غير بوابة. اليوم أول يوم من باقي عمري، سطر جديد من أول كتاب. 1000 صفحة بتبدأ بكلمة زي المفاتيح من غير بوابة.
احنا كل يوم نهتف بنقول بدنا إنسانية، علم منصوب عليه أعلام المثلى الأبدية. بوجه اتهامي لكل العالم اللي ساكت عن ألامي. أكم من واحد مات، بقول بكفي عالم يوقف شلال دماء، نوقف بخط صفاء بكفي اندماء.
وثلاث ارباع الناس ما في عندهم بيت، وكتير من الناس في بنات الحيط، والباقي من الناس عايشين بياريت انه يفيق الانسان ويتهدم هالحيط.
Bizitzak badauka zenbait arrazoi bizitza ospatzeko. Bizitzak badauka tristuratik aurrera egiteko. Bizitzak badauka minatik maitatzen jarraitzeko. Bizitzak badauka musika mesteko eta elkartzeko. Palestinan checkpoint rock zubiak eraikiz. Palestinan checkpoint rock isiltasuna utziz. Palestinan checkpoint rock rap sustraiei eutziz. Palestinan checkpoint rock arreziak errautziz. Palestinan checkpoint rock